Welcome to the Speakeasy, a podcast of the local church. The Speakeasy is a place for unfiltered conversations on faith and justice. At each gathering, we invite a special guest to share their story in conversation around a particular topic or issue related to faith and justice. We hope the Speakeasy inspires empathy, fosters common ground, and cultivates deeper connections in our community and beyond. To learn more about the local church, visit growlocal.church or just come see us one Sunday morning. Here's the pastor of the local church, Brent Levy.
Friends, welcome to the Speakeasy. This is a gathering for unfiltered conversation on faith and justice. We hold these monthly, and we have had conversations on racial justice and environmental justice. Today, we're talking with Katey Zeh, the Reverend Katey Zeh, about reproductive justice. My name is Brent. I serve as pastor of the local church, which is a United Methodist faith community here in Chatham County, and we are just so excited to be able to engage in these conversations that we have here in person with you, but also we're recording to go online as well. So I'm just delighted. Katey, let me introduce you, if you don't mind. The Reverend Katey Zeh, pronounced she, her, Zeh, right?
Zeh,
Z-E-H, but Zeh, is an ordained Baptist minister and the chief executive officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. The Center for American Progress named her one of their top justice-seeking faith leaders to watch for her work on reproductive freedom. No big deal. I added that. Reverend Katey has written for many outlets, including the Washington Post, Sojourners, Religious News Services, Religion Dispatches, and she regularly appears in the media, including The Atlantic, CNN, which we were just talking about, The Nation, BBC, NBC News, Newsweek, and The Christian Century. The co-creator of the Kindreds podcast, the author of 2 books, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing and the Pro-Choice Movement, and Women Rise Up, Sacred Stories of Resistance for Today's Revolution. So that is what the internet says you are, Katey. Who is Katey to Katey, then?
You should ask my buds up here.
Who do
They
you
have
say?
some good answers. It's always awkward to have your bio read.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It just feels...
Do you have any edits? You want to change anything?
No, it's
Okay.
just like this weird highlight reel of all of these very strange moments when people actually think I have something interesting to say.
And so much left out, I'm sure, too.
Yeah, for sure. Who am I to myself? Let's see. I'm a Southern girl. I grew up in Georgia. I was born in Virginia, but I grew up in a small town. I'm a recovering evangelical.
Okay.
I'm a mom, I'm a partner, a friend, and really in these times trying to find what it means to do this work with joy and fun, which feels really hard when we're up against so much crisis. But what does it mean to be living holistically in doing really difficult work, trying to change the world? Because I think having grown up evangelical, I thought I needed to just continuously deny my own self and realizing like I'm part of the world that I'm trying to create. And so I want to experience the things that I want for everybody else. I'm in this stage of my life
Don't I get a
figuring
voice?
out-
Don't I have a say?
Right.
Yeah.
And like, I also want liberation for myself. And so learning how to live into the values I want to see in the world in my own life and in my own small team and family is really big for me. So that doesn't show up in the bio, but the way that I approach the work, I try to do with like the fierce discipline of just stubborn hope and joy and pleasure in the work. Yeah.
I want to come back to all of those things.
Okay, sounds good.
Fierce hope, joy, pleasure, yeah. Your bio didn't say this, but I imagine when you were a kid, you dreamed of growing up and writing a book on reproductive choice. Am I wrong there? And if I'm wrong, how did you get here? Tell us about that journey.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even want to write that book when I wrote that book.
Okay, that's fair.
So,
yeah, sure.
I can talk a little bit about that.
Would love to.
But yeah, I mean, so we were talking a little bit before. I grew up in a very evangelical small town, but my family was not religious. So I had no real exposure to Christianity other than like culturally. I remember the first time I went to a nativity play, I was fascinated. I was like, is that a real baby up there? I mean, I just wanted to be part of it. And so the first time I really entered into church was with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, when she was sick. And I just kind of fell in love with it. I was too old for the children's church at that time, so I had to sit.
About how old were you?
I think I was like 8, 7, 8, somewhere in there. So I had to sit through the sermon, but there was something about the tradition that was very intriguing to me. And after she died, it was a way for me to stay connected. Sure. Even though my family was not part of church at all, I wanted to continue going, and got more and more immersed in like evangelicalism, which I then left, but became very faithful kind of my own volition, which I think is very unique. Most people, were raised with it or didn't feel like they had a choice, but I very much did. Went to college, started to do what was called, I didn't know it was deconstruction of my faith, but started to learn more about the tradition historically, learned how the scriptures were created, started to figure out there were lots of different ways to be faithful. But it wasn't until I went to Yale Divinity School and I decided to actually take a training with the organization I now run. They were teaching people, how do you journey alongside somebody who has a pregnancy that they're not sure what they're going to do with? And for me, I just felt like that was practical. It was relevant to so many people's lives, and also asking all the big questions that we do in seminary. What does life mean? Who is God? Who are we as human beings? And I wanted to use those skills. And so I ended up asking if I could go just do a tour of a local Planned Parenthood that was just down the street where I'd seen protesters and everything. They let me come in, and I was so taken with what I saw that I asked if I could volunteer. And I ended up, long story, but I ended up in the procedure room with patients.
Wow.
During their procedures, being that person to just hold their hands. And I felt awkward. I didn't know what to do or say. I mean, it was very vulnerable, but it was very transformative for me. And at the same time...
What was it about it that you said you were taken by it? What in particular?
It's just one of those ineffable faith moments where I could just feel that it was holy, sacred
something
work.
Sacred. Yeah,
it was
sure.
something sacred. It was sacred for the patients, the way the doctors and nurses and staff cared for the patients. And also the juxtaposition of that with Christians standing outside, protesting, harassing. I mean, they assumed I was a patient, so I felt what that felt like. Mm-hmm. What does it feel like to be targeted and to be harassed going into a health clinic? So those two things, I just felt like there's got to be a different way. There's got to be a different way to do this, to be faithful and to stand with the people who are coming into the clinic and those who are working there. So that's the origin story, and I call it my call to ministry. That call to ministry happened within the abortion room, which is probably the last place I would have expected my call, but that's where it came.
Isn't that how God works sometimes?
That is how God works, yes, very much.
And so how did the book come about then, out of this experience? And
So
a complicated choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd written my first book, came out in 2019.
It's Women Rise Up?
Women Rise Up, 2019. So I was not really ready to write another book. That one took me a long time. My daughter was a baby when I wrote it. And
Women Rise Up holds sacred stories of women in Scripture.
Yes.
With a bent toward lessons that we can learn from their stories in the modern resistance justice movements.
Yes.
Fair?
Yeah. And actually, United Methodist Women used it as one of their reading list books. So cool. I had a lot of United Methodist women reading it, which was really great. I got to be in conversation. And I'm no longer United Methodist, but United Methodist Women, well, it's like women, it's something else now. Someone help me out. Y'all know what that's called now? It's like Church Women United or Women in Faith. They were United Methodist Women when I was there. But lovely groups. But yeah, I worked for the United Methodist Church for a while doing advocacy work, and one of the things I was asked to do was find scripture to help support the work that I was doing. And so it kind of it invited me to revisit some of these sacred stories and to realize that so much of what's going on in the sacred text is going on now. We just call it something different. And so to connect the struggle for gender equity now with these ancient stories, to give women of faith specifically a framework to see their own stories, but also to connect with their advocacy work to the tradition and to give them something hopeful was what I did with that book. So in 2020, when we're all home, my kids not in school,
anything else to do.
Didn't have anything else to do. I got an email from a publisher and they said, "Do you have your next book idea?" And I'm like, well, when a publisher asks if you have a book idea, you you come up
The
with some
answer is
ideas.
yes. Yeah.
Yes, that doesn't happen often, right? Like normally people are trying to find a publisher. And I have a publisher saying, we want to work with you. What do you want to write? And I pitched 3 different things, and one of them was a book about reproductive loss more generally. And I wanted it to be very comprehensive and to talk about infertility and miscarriage and adoption, like all the things that can be felt as losses, including abortion. Because I just felt like there really wasn't anything out there for people like that in a comprehensive way. And then the publisher came back and they're like, that chapter about abortion? Yeah, we want you to write the whole book about that. And I think I was just too scared to pitch that book because at that time I was getting targeted a lot. I mean, I had been targeted consistently throughout my career, which can be very scary sometimes. But then I thought, this is the book that needs to be written. There needs to be a book that addresses the full human experience around abortion, that pushes up against what I think are very false narratives or false binary narrative that either, abortion's a healthcare decision, it didn't mean anything else, or it was the worst thing I ever did. Like that did not match all of the people who I'd interacted with from the time in the clinic all the way through that time. And I just feel like I didn't know, we knew that the decision around Roe was going to happen at some point, but my book came out just a couple months before the leaked decision, and I didn't know when I wrote it, but I think it really was.
Which was early 22, is that right? Or
it was
21?
May 22.
May 22.
Yeah, the decision came down in June.
Right.
Right. Just a couple days after my birthday. I'm like, please, not on my birthday. It was like 2 days later. But I was so glad to have already created something to help people understand how we got here and also how we're going to get out. So I'm really grateful for the invitation, the push from the publisher to say, we really want you to write this book. And for me, it helped me reconnect to those early moments of journeying alongside people because it is a storytelling book. I'm not someone who has experienced abortion in my life, but I wanted to make sure that the people who had were centered and to show as many different kinds of stories as possible to help push up against our stereotypes, misconceptions of like who has abortions, and to really center them and make sure that I told their stories well, because I think that's how we become more compassionate, is we push up against the abstract and we actually talk to the people who are really impacted in what their lives are like.
Let it be embodied and enfleshed.
Yes, because it's not abstract. It's real people, their real lives making decisions in real time and having a whole host of emotions about that. That's why I call it a complicated choice, that for some people, there's a lot of complicated feelings they have about it.
Of course. I'd love to hear more about some of those stories in a complicated choice. And I want to say we have a few copies of Women Rise Up as well as a complicated choice in the back, and you're welcome to take them, take one with you. When you're done with it, give it away to somebody else who you might.
And I'm happy to sign copies or.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
But before we get to those stories, I would love for you to help us sort of trace how we got here. We heard how you got here, right?
Yeah.
But how did we get here with all of this? Because when we were talking earlier, you shared some things with me that I didn't know. Like, for instance, the Southern Baptist Convention for a long time was considered pro-choice into the 80s, right? And so can you trace, and you've also mentioned the role that Christian supremacy and white supremacy have played in it all. And I just a small question of, can you help us chart that journey to sort of where we are today?
Yeah, sure. Not a historian, but I'll do my best to cite the historians I've worked with on this. I mean, I think for one, it's important to say that within the sacred text, there really isn't much about this. I mean, there's very little attention paid to pregnancy at all. We could talk more about the text, but there's really nothing there. And also, abortion was not always illegal in this country. It was legal and then made illegal and then made legal again. So there's been a back and forth, but I think, our collective memory is so short. What we think of are the last 30 years in terms of the narrative around it. But my organization in the 60s started with clergy who formed what was called the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, if you haven't heard of it. They were in 38 states and had like thousands of members of clergy who were helping people who needed access to abortion get access to safe, compassionate abortion care, whether that was within their state, going out of the country, and they helped about 500,000 people between 1967 and 1973. Wow. So we're talking very robust. And they were also advocating for more liberal abortion laws within their states. Not as controversial as you would think. Most of their faith traditions supported what they were doing. Also clergy at the time, predominantly white men. So it wasn't as risky as it might sound at the time. Still courageous, but very much, with the support of their institutions. And so after the Roe decision happened, those same clergy said, well, we need to stick around to make sure we codify this at the state level. And we became what was then the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, and then later Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in 1994. But what happened? I mean, at the time, most Protestant denominations were pro-choice, including the Southern Baptist Convention. And I like to say that Reverend Billy Graham was supportive of Planned Parenthood and said he disagreed with the Catholic stance on abortion at the time. So yeah, how did we get here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So historians have different theories about all of this, but if you and again, I was born in 1983, so this is before my time. So this is my understanding. This is the 1970s. We've got civil rights. We've got, historically marginalized groups getting more rights than they had before. And that's really concerning to people who've been holding power, right? Conservative Republicans were concerned because they're starting to lose their grip on political power. And so figuring out how they were going to get it back was a big part of this story. And my understanding is that one of the first litmus tests of this was Richard Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972. And what he found was that he could bring this sort of his operatives found that he could form this kind of unholy alliance between Mormons, white conservative evangelicals, and white conservative Catholics who don't agree on anything theologically, right? They don't agree on anything about Christianity whatsoever, but they share sexism and racism and homophobia. So figuring out a messaging campaign that would be like a dog whistle for them was really important. And it was an anti-abortion platform and also an anti-segregation and anti-desegregation platform. So they were pushing back on busing and integration of schools. And so if you look at the materials from 1972, a lot of them are both very racist and very anti-abortion. And it worked. I mean, it worked for getting that voting bloc to vote for Richard Nixon. And so that was kind of the origin of it. And you sort of see that take off, that became the center.
It sort of snowballed from there.
Snowballed, because it worked really well, but it wasn't salient politically to be racist in their messaging. So that was not going to be the center of their platform. But abortion became the thing that they could start organizing around and to, tell people to be a faithful person, you need to vote in this way. Abortion needs to be the most important issue for you so that they could control votes. And also, when I've looked at other historians, if you think about the family policy councils and things that were formed in the 1980s, they had a whole agenda that we now see coming to fruition. I mean, they're talking about controlling every aspect of government in the 1980s. And we see that in some of the language coming out now, we talked about the Alabama Supreme Court ruling where we have a judge who's citing theology for his reasoning, right? It's not just abortion that they care about. They want to create a Christian state. They want a theocracy. And abortion just became one of the issues that they could organize around and win elections, even when
and it happens to be, as you said, a pretty salient one that...
Right, you talk about saving babies. They did a really good job with the messaging, but it's about so much more than that. Really is about control and creating a theocracy and disrupting religious freedom for everybody else. So that's a little bit, there's a lot more to it, but I think it's just important to understand it hasn't always been that way, and there's a political machine behind it that's pushing an agenda that's much broader than this, but at the expense of people who need reproductive health care.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Could you say something about a little more about Christian supremacy and white supremacy in terms of the ways that has become sort of baked into and maybe even the intersectionality of the conversation related to reproductive justice?
Well, maybe I can start with just what the reproductive justice frame is.
Great.
Is that helpful?
Yeah.
So this is now, I think they're celebrating the 30th anniversary of reproductive justice. And this was formed Indigenous women and Black women at 2 separate gatherings came up with this like very similar frameworks, which I think is always interesting when there's an idea that needs to be birthed into the world. It often occurs to more than one group. I think that's like really important, not like who came up with it, but this is something that needs to come into the public conversation. So within like a year, there were these 2 separate gatherings. And basically what they were saying
And it wasn't white men who came up with this. Just, that's fascinating.
Yeah, right, exactly. But actually what they were really pushing up against, less white men and more the white women who had been at the forefront of reproductive rights, because what they were saying is it's not enough to have legal access to abortion if I can't access it financially, if there's not a provider in my area, and also what good does it do to be able to make a decision to end a pregnancy if I can't make the decision to have a pregnancy and be healthy and to raise my child in a healthy environment. And it shouldn't just be about this one aspect. It should be about like the full spectrum of our lives. And so the reproductive justice framework is much more comprehensive, and even from the time it was created has been expanded upon as there are activists of generations now. But the original frame is the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. And they've since added like bodily autonomy and the right to pleasure as part of that. But if you think about that, it's about so much more. I mean, it's about having like sensible gun laws. It's about having like a safe environment, clean water, good work, education.
It encompasses so much
healthcare.
Of the human existence.
It's everything.
Yeah.
And I think it's a helpful frame because I think there's entry points. If no matter what issue you're passionate about, there's a connection to reproductive justice because it is about human flourishing overall. And when I think about like the Christian supremacy messaging, which is also deeply racist about abortion, I don't know if you remember, there were these billboards that said like the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb, where they were like really targeting Black communities, saying like abortion providers were there to like create genocide, basically. But then when you say, well, what about the fact that Black women die 3 times as often in childbirth as white women, regardless of socioeconomic status? Right? Like they don't have anything to say about that, So to me, it really starts to break down the whole idea of it being pro-life. It's really a a lot of people call it pro-birth, like forcing people to give birth under conditions where they, could lose their lives or especially now we see like people are on the brink of death, unable to get abortion care. How close to the brink of death do you need to be to have a life-saving abortion, So I think for me, like you just sort of see the breakdown when you push up against like, what does it really mean to support
You ask
families?
enough questions, you get,
Yeah, right. It's so overly simplistic.
Right.
And there's not an answer to like the broader, more difficult questions around like, how do we create equity? How do we create human flourishing for everybody? Yeah.
Well, and it becomes so much of an individual sort of frame, right? Like there's no sense of supporting the community, as the community supports the child as well.
Absolutely.
So that pro-birth language is really helpful.
Yeah, you're kind of on your own. You get pregnant, you're on your own.
Right.
You have a kid, you're on your own.
Just don't end it, but we're not going to help you.
Yeah,
past
it's
that,
sort of like you got what you deserved. There's a little bit it's very punitive. I mean, and I think that's the difference that I see now in the laws today versus, in the 70s, is there's just this punitive nature, like helping someone get access to abortion care a felony, a crime, or like that anyone can sue someone who helps someone get access to abortion care. It's just so focused on like penalization and criminalization of pregnant people often, which was happening before this, but we see an uptick in that too, that if you come into the hospital with a suspicious kind of miscarriage, right, you can be accused of trying to get health care, and then you become criminalized for it.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have just wrestled with a little bit is there seems to be this pervasive understanding that to be pro-faith is equal to pro-life or anti-choice, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say more about that, and is there a way, and I'm not sure like these binaries are necessarily helpful,
Yeah.
because as you're naming, it is so much more complex than just an either or.
Right.
And so I wonder how you have navigated that yourself, as you think about it from, a theological perspective as well, the ways that your divinity school training and your time in faith communities, how has that shaped where you have landed, and even not landed, but where you are now, right? Because I wonder if do we ever land? I don't know.
We evolve,
we evolve,
for sure.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting.
If you're not changing, you're not growing, right? You're not
That's
growing,
right.
You're not changing, yeah.
I always find it interesting with evangelicalism, especially because I feel like what I was taught was Jesus was this loving, caring, compassionate
Merciful,
person
all the
who
things.
journeyed with people through their most difficult moments, and that was like I still had access to that, right? So those are the values. But then when it comes to a social issue like abortion, it's like all of that somehow goes away. Like we're not supposed to have compassion, we're supposed to have judgment. And for me, that just bumps up against everything that's at the very core of what I believe my faith tradition teaches me, which
There's
is
a real dissonance.
Yeah. And so I think once I studied the text, I'm like, there's really nothing here. There's a lot of reproductive oppression in the scriptures, but there's nothing that talks about like the experience of an abortion. I'm sure it was happening at the time. We know it was happening at the time. There's really nothing there. And so when I started looking at the text, and I talk about this story in both books, for me, in the absence of an abortion story, for me, the story in the Gospels of the hemorrhaging woman is the central story around this, because she has some kind of gynecological issue that has ostracized her from the community. She uses all of her resources to go within the bounds of what's acceptable with doctors who, she's now got no money and she's worse, right? That's what the text says. She is like exhausted all of her resources, and she's not supposed to be in community. And when Jesus comes through her area, she's like, this is my last shot. I mean, that's what I think. She's like, this is my last chance. And so she figures out a way to get what she needs. I mean, tries to remain hidden, remains close to the ground, right, to touch the hem of his garment. And like, Jesus isn't even aware of that.
But power goes out from him.
Power goes out from him.
I got excited.
I mean, she is the catalyst of her own healing. And she changes Jesus. Like, it's her that changes him within. And I think expands his healing and his ministry. And he's like, who touched me? Genuine curiosity, who touched me? And I think about the bravery of her. Like, she could have just left with her healing, her physical healing, but she chose, in spite of the fear, to share what happened and to tell her whole story. And the more I've thought about this, she's speaking this publicly in a crowd of people, probably some of whom have ostracized her, and probably people who have
are afraid
similar,
of her, yeah.
are afraid of her, and people who are experiencing something similar because they're there for healing too. So there's like individual healing that happens for her, but also she is healing community by sharing her story. And I think that tells me everything that I need to know about people making tough decisions about their reproductive lives, which is like sometimes we have to go beyond the bounds of what is socially acceptable to get the healing that we need, and that we deeply know what we need within ourselves. And in this case, Jesus blesses that, affirms her. And again, she doesn't wait to be healed. She really heals herself. I mean, she reaches out for the source, but it is her own reaching out, the daring, the courage to reach out, and then healing the community by telling the story that we now tell now. To me, that is the central.
Yeah.
That's the central story. There is no judgment there. And we don't know what the cause of her bleeding was. I mean, maybe she had an abortion. I don't know. I mean, who knows what it was? It could have been a sexually transmitted infection. We don't know. But that's not what's important. What's important is her courage, her faith, and the bravery she has in telling what her life story has been, like speaking out about her shame, I think. And so much of the abortion conversation, I think, is like dealing with the silencing that stigmatizes the experience. And when you're asking about my own journey, when I talked about going into the clinic and feeling what it felt like to be perceived to be a woman there to have an abortion, and everything within me was like, wanted to be like, I am not here for an abortion. Like, that is not why I'm here. And then I thought, why do I care? Why do I care? I did care. I did not want to be seen that way. And so I had to go, wow, even though I am here to support people having abortions, I have my own
And just a
judgment.
small sliver, too, of the
Yes.
the stigma, the shame
Yes.
that's piled on.
Yeah. But I was like, I need to do my own work around, why do I care? What do I think about people who have abortions? And to me, abortion stigma is just like racism and sexism and heterosexism. I mean, it is part of this living in this culture. We are all surrounded by anti-abortion messaging because of white Christian nationalism. That we all have developed this idea that abortion is something to be avoided, that it's gross, that we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to see it, we don't want to hear about it. It's like this thing that happens in the shadows. And I think that functions politically to keep us from having these conversations, which has honestly been the silver lining of the whole overturn of Roe, has been the desire to have a conversation like this one. And I'm grateful because, there are many of us who've been talking about this for a long time. It was just really hard to get people's attention because I think there was this idea that Roe was the law of the land and we're good, even though lots of people didn't have access to abortion before the overturn. But now it's like, now everyone realizes where we are, and now we have an opportunity to change it. But I think it requires us to deal with the judgment that we have. And I don't think it's our fault that we have it, but it is our responsibility to deal with it and to say, what does compassion look like? Do I have to totally understand where someone's coming from to ask them how I can be helpful as they're journeying through something difficult? Like, I don't really feel like I need to know the answers around all of the abstract abortion questions to be a compassionate presence for people. I don't really think that's what I'm asked to do, to figure out the mysteries of life and death.
Like
kind of beyond
when
me.
does life start? When does personhood begin? Like those sorts of questions.
Right, we talked about this, and these are ancient questions. I mean, I find them fascinating. I love talking about what does life mean and what does death mean and all of that, but they're questions we can't answer definitively. And so in the absence of that, what do I choose to do? I choose compassion. I choose to journey. I choose to hold space and trust that the people making the decisions are the ones who are most well-informed to make the decisions for themselves. I shouldn't be doing that. No one else should be making a decision for somebody else.
You mentioned earlier the fact that this goes beyond an issue, but is embodied and fleshed in people's lives. One of the genesis of this forum, these conversations, were that it's so hard to argue with somebody's story. You can argue abstract all you want, but it's and debate, but it's really hard to argue with somebody's story. And I mean, that's one of the reasons Jesus is so dear to me as the Word made flesh, right? Like embodied and incarnate. I wonder about some of those stories that you carry with you that have stuck with you, if you don't mind sharing them and feel like you're able to do that, to help us sort of come with you in that way.
This is always so hard for me because there's so many.
I'm sure, yes.
Let's see. I always just try to be open to who comes to mind in the moment, because I interviewed so many people and I've met so many people who've experienced abortion in their lives, but the one who's coming to me, I'm forgetting her name right now. One of the things I think that's so important around just the misconceptions is understanding that most people who access abortion care already are parents. It's majority. So most of them are already raising children. Heidi is her name. And she had 2 kids, really struggled with mental illness, had postpartum psychosis after her second, had to be hospitalized, and got pregnant a 3rd time, really wanted to continue the pregnancy, but it was debilitating for her and mentally. And her partner became very abusive and controlling and was on the one hand berating her for not being able to get up and go to work. But then when she's like, I need to end this pregnancy, he was like, you're killing my baby. So she just felt like this was a way for him to, control her. And she was like, if I continue this pregnancy, I will be tied to my abuser for the rest of my life. And it wasn't until she was able, I think her mom was the one who was able to help her with the money to terminate that pregnancy. But she was able to heal psychologically, because honestly, the brain chemistry that happens with pregnancy hormones for some people really does send them into deep, deep depression, debilitating depression, not just after, but during pregnancy. So once she was able to heal from that, she was able to leave that partner. And then when I met her, she had gotten remarried and now has a third baby with her new partner. But I just think abortion so often is a parenting decision that people make. It's like, I'm raising these children. I don't have what I need to do this again, and I need to care for the kids that I have, and also like the right timing for her with the right partner. So Heidi's the one who comes to mind, and she actually does. She's in Ohio, and she has a whole nonprofit around helping single moms. Right, so she was able to continue that work because she herself got like the healing that she needed in order to do that work, and so is improving the lives of moms in her community too. So that's one that's coming to mind for me.
And her story led her to continue to help and to heal others. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any others?
Let me think about that. There's also, I mean, I guess, I don't know why abusive relationships are coming up for me, but there was another young woman I talked to who I think was about to go to college. Her name was Kawanda, and I feel like she got pregnant, and then, man, I remember what she told me. There's a nonprofit in Texas. This was like before Roe was overturned, but a nonprofit in Texas that would help young people get access to a judicial bypass. So if you're in Texas at the time, if you're a minor, you couldn't access abortion care without your parents signing off, which for people in bad relationships with their parents was really difficult because they're not going to feel like they can ask their parents to go with them to get an abortion. So this organization helped her get the money and also the judicial bypass that she needed. But she remembers talking, like she was in a very abusive relationship with this man, and he was supposed to come pick her up from the clinic after she was done with her procedure. And she was just sitting there, like waiting for him to come. He never showed up. And she said at the time, she was like, this is what my life would have been. I would have had a baby, but he like would never have come to get me. And just kind of like realizing what her life would have been like had she not made that decision. And she was able to go on and go to school after that. And she was the first one who told me my abortion was a blessing. And she's like, the anti-abortion people hate that, but for me, it saved my life. Like it kept me from being in this abusive relationship. It allowed me to go to school, she's just delightful. So I think a lot about how, for most of the people I've talked to, they can look back and say that decision to end a pregnancy was such a like catalyzing moment where they were like, how am I going to make meaning of this? What decision am I going to make now that I have this, I have now this clarity about what my life needs to be? What decision am I going to make? And I think for so many people, it was just that turning point moment of, this is really who I want to be. This is really what I want to do.
That fierce hope that you were talking about earlier.
And like freedom, the freedom. And taking that really like to heart and being super discerning about like, I want this to be meaningful. So what am I going to do in response? That's what I hear in so many of the stories. Not that that's true for everybody. It's just something I've heard a lot.
I'm going to ask another question. We're going to, if you have questions, would love for you to share them in a few minutes. What's the most challenging part of your job, your role? And then what brings you the most joy?
What is the most challenging part of my job?
You can pick one thing. One thing.
I mean, I've shared this with people. I remember sharing this at Wild Goose. If any of you all go to Wild Goose Festival, I was there a few years ago. And I said, I've been doing this work for, at the time, like almost 20 years. And we have never had a win. I mean, there have been little wins, but it's mostly been about like maintaining,
holding your ground,
not losing. And then of course, experiencing major loss that just gets more and more devastating. So that's really difficult, like just to know that within my own lifetime, I'm probably not going to see the fruits of what it is we're trying to do.
Does that cause you to question, like, what am I doing here? What's the point of this?
I had days in actually when I really got into a deep depression after SB 8 in Texas. So that was 2021. That was the first one. I remember that decision came down, very draconian abortion law. And I sat at my computer and I'm like, just type something. Just type something. I was like, just say something. I'm like, I have nothing to say. Mm-hmm. I am outraged out. I am out of outrage. I have been outraged continuously for like 15 years and I cannot do it. Like I had no emotional reaction. And I knew at that point, I'm like, I have not been doing a good job of caring for myself doing this work. And I mean, that was burnout for me. And my therapist said, you must take time off. You must get a break, because I had no words. I had nothing to say. It was the first time that had happened to me. And so that was a big turning point for me, where I'm like, if I'm gonna stay in this work long term, I have to figure out a different way to be motivated. It cannot be rage induced. And also I realized bringing anger and rage is just reinforcing the very things that I say that I'm against. Because I don't want to infuse the world with anger and rage. Like, that's not the world I want to live in. It's not the life I want to live. Mm-hmm. But I see so many of my colleagues, that is what motivates them. It's rage. And you can feel it. It's palpable, and it feels just like our opposition in terms of, like, it's different words but the same energy. Mm-hmm. And so I think the biggest challenge and like joy for me has been going, you know what, I'm going to shift. I have to shift the approach. It has to be life-giving. It has to feel inviting and warm and welcoming and loving and caring. And like, yes, we can speak the truth, but it doesn't need to be in battle language. It does not need to be in war language. Mm-hmm. It can be something different. And I think that
don't become what you're up against, right?
Yes. Yeah. And this is a really silly example, but I was married at the time that this happened, and this guy like spent half an hour on YouTube just blasting me, this minister. And I recorded myself just like eating some grapes responding to this guy. And then my husband at the time like spliced it together into this like very funny compilation video that just made me laugh. It was just because it was so absurd. And I just remember thinking, like, I have to find like the humor in this, and also the compassion for the people who are so opposed to this. Like, I have a lot of compassion for them because I grew up in an environment where I was told this is right, this is wrong. I know what it means to come from that. And there is something very comforting about being so sure that you're right. So I bring that compassion to the people who are opposed to the work that I do. Yeah. And that means that I have so much more energy to do the life-giving work of like having these conversations, talking to people who are going through an abortion experience, talking about stories that have changed me. And I just love it so much more. And I know that this is going to take a long time and lots of people, and I'm not the only one doing the work. But I feel like if I can do my little piece in that way, other people want to come and be part of that, because people want to be part of something positive and hope-filled and magnetic, and like joy-filled. Mm-hmm. And I've seen a huge shift in like the partnerships coming toward us now that we are embodying that. And it's kind of hard to describe exactly what that means, but it's just that if you feel like an energetic shift, I can feel it in the work that we're doing. And like one thing that we're planning right now, do you mind if I tell one quick story?
No.
It's
all you.
All right. So there's this is all in the works, but there's a health center in West Virginia that provided abortion care called Women's Health Center. And West Virginia legislature banned abortion. And the owner of that clinic said, we're gonna figure out a way to continue abortion care. So they went right across the state line to Maryland and purchased a clinic where they can do abortion care there, like where she can see West Virginia from the office. So like that story of resilience is so powerful to me, that people like find ways to continue the work even when it's so difficult.
There's a creativity.
Yeah, and we've been asked to come and one of the things that we do is actually bless clinics and the staff. And I said, could we bring the West Virginia staff to Maryland and do this together? Like, these folks have never met each other. one staff is grieving, the other is celebrating. And like, can we do something to just edify all of you together? Like, that your work is sacred. It's already sacred, but that you feel that it has been blessed and that it's holy. So that's something that we get to do. It's like, so cool. Go and be in community with the people who are doing this day in and day out. And like, nothing gives me more joy than just celebrating the people who are doing this work day in, day out, regardless of how hard it is. And that's what's amazing, is like the resilience of people. Like, communities always make sure that their communities are cared for. And I point to the midwives in Exodus who like were resisting, Shifra and Pua. I mean, there are always these midwives, there's healers who are like, we don't care what the state says, we're gonna make sure people are cared for. That is an ancient practice that continues. And so there is something outside of the political reality. There are many things happening outside of the political reality that are life-giving and healing and good. And so I try to remember those parts of it while we still try to change the political reality too.
Sure. Well, and so that brings me to the last question that I have. We've seen Arizona just this week go reinforce the Civil War era law. We've seen in Alabama questions about IVF and fertility care for women as a result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. For women who have experienced miscarriage, there are questions about DNCs and things like that. What is the work for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and your work in particular? Like, how are you navigating, responding to the aftermath of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and in all of the ways that it's affecting life just beyond abortion?
Yeah. So a few things. One, before Roe was overturned, we knew that a lot of people were going to be navigating abortion care in different ways, and having to do so, on their phones and stuff. And so we created a site called Abortion's Welcome that's a pro-choice spiritual companion for people, because we knew like people cannot always go to their faith communities when they need spiritual support. So we created that with a partner in Mississippi called Faith and Women. But that also has, like, if you need, access to medication abortion, how do you get it? If you need legal support, how do you get it? We wanted to make sure that people who are Googling this stuff are finding us and not getting sucked into an anti-abortion site. So that's one thing that we do.
A pregnancy support center or something.
Right. Like folks who are not super clear about what their motivations are. So we created that to be a spiritual companion for people before, during, and after abortion. So making sure that we're providing care to those folks is one thing that we do. Another is educating people like y'all, or just talking to people about how we got here, because many people were like, what happened? A lot of people didn't see the overturn of Roe happening, even though we were saying it was going to happen. But like explaining how that happened, how the courts were stacked, all the laws leading up to this moment, the rise of white Christian nationalism, helping people understand how we got here, because I think that's the only way we're going to get ourselves out. So that's another way. It's just, we have a whole learning center. Yeah, we have a whole learning center if you're interested, called the Religion and Repro Learning Center. There are courses on there with like the smartest scholars about all of these things. So that's another thing that we do. And supporting providers, like I was talking about with the clinic blessing, is another thing that we do. And we also work with young people. I do a lot of work with campuses and like student-oriented groups, because one, they're the ones impacted by these laws, but also they're activists in their own right. And I got involved, when I was a student myself.
That's your story. Yeah.
So thinking about like who's coming behind me, and all of us doing this work now, making sure that that their leadership is being honored, that they're shaping the conversation, and that they have the skills and tools that they need. So I speak to seminaries and student groups. And we also, in May, are doing our first virtual, what we call compassionate care. So how do you journey alongside someone making a reproductive decision in light of the overturn of Roe? We used to do that in person, and for several days. We're like, people don't have the attention span for several days now, but a 90-minute training, on how you do that. And a lot of that's about dealing with your own abortion stigma.
Sure.
So that's free to anybody who wants to do it.
It sounds like
right. Because like the reality is that most of us are probably not going to be asked to journey alongside somebody, but we're probably going to encounter someone's story. And so if we've done the internal work of like, what are my judgments? Why do I feel a certain way? Maybe about pregnancy past a certain point, like figuring out all of that stuff so that you're ready to have those compassionate, judgment-free conversations with people. So we don't do as much of the like policy work. We're small, we're like 3 people, but we've figured out what are the unique things that we can do, you know, in conversation with all these other folks who are doing policy work and pushing a religious freedom argument right around all of this too.
Well, that encompasses such a large part of people's lives too, which is the spiritual.
Yes.
You know. So yes, small, but significant impact.
Especially given how we got here.
Yes, that's
has been so framed, like Christianity has been weaponized in this conversation so much. How do we find the liberatory parts? And I always say, like, Christianity is the religion of empire, and it's also the religion of liberation. And which are we going to choose?
Oh, be a great place to like end the podcast. But we have questions. Do you have questions? You get to pick.
Yes, Liz. I can repeat the question, or if you do.
That'd be great.
Okay.
In regards to abortion and women's rights, what's something that you hope that you get to see in your lifetime?
What do I hope I can see in my lifetime with regard to abortion rights? What I hope is we see more states taking this on and codifying it within their state constitution. I think that's something that we've already seen. So having more states where they are like, I don't want to use the word sanctuary, but states where we know that it's codified in the law. I think we've already seen that happen. I hope that that will continue. And I hope that we can defeat any attempt to make a constitutional amendment around personhood, which is really what their next aim is, that let's pass the Equal Rights Amendment. I think that can happen in our lifetime. Yeah, Equal Rights Amendment.
Love it.
Thanks, Liz.
Colleen.
How can we be helpful? Yeah, hopeful. Yeah, well, I think one thing that gives me hope is just seeing how politically unpopular this is, right? Like whenever there's been an opportunity for a ballot measure around this since the overturn, it's been wildly unpopular, including in redder states. So and we know this just statistically, that it's not popular among majority of people. Majority of people are in support of legal abortion. So that gives me hope, right? But then it's a matter of figuring out the political machinery to make that a reality. But I think we should remember that like the people, the voting population, wants legal abortion access. They weren't in favor of the overturn of Roe. So that gives me a lot of hope, because if we have that, then it's just about like channeling that. How do we get those people voting? Like, what is the platform? So I hope that gives you some hope, and that is, you know, really happening. This election season will be very interesting to see, right, what happens.
That's a word for it, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. But I think being helpful and hopeful are actually related. And one of the things, if you all don't know about, is the Carolina Abortion Fund, which I actually helped start when I first moved here. But that's a group, they're helping folks in South Carolina and North Carolina get access to abortion care and funding them. So know that work has been happening, that they're doing it with a justice lens. So I always recommend folks donate to them, figure out how to support them. And also thinking, if this is something that you're interested in, like what can your actual faith community do? Because a lot of times, I worked with Binkley Baptist in Chapel Hill, and one of the things that they asked me, I did a similar talk, and they were like, what can we do? I said, start here. Like, what within your own community can you do? Like, and what do faith communities do well? We do ritual really well. And I said, maybe there's space here to do ritual around like just storytelling about our reproductive lives. Not even just abortion, but like, what does it mean to have a reproductive story? Because even within that group, there were people who are like, I had infertility. I never got to have kids. Like, there's so much shame, secrecy, silencing. And that they did that. And then that like catapulted them into like having this whole group that wanted to be active. But I think so often it just starts with like, what do we do well in our community right now to start addressing this? And it can be like beautiful for community building, just thinking about like, how do we use the things that we're already good at around this? We don't have to go like reinvent the wheel. It's starting right where we are. And sometimes having those tough conversations with the people we already know and love in our community with, those are the people who have changed me. When I think about my evolution on lots of things, they were people who asked me hard questions and who loved me through my struggling. And I think that's how we shift, is just starting right where we are. I hope that answers your question.
Dennis, yeah.
Yes, first of all, I just want to thank you for your frankness and positive attitude. It seems dark. But I'm wondering if you can speak to a more general, which is, how is it that, in your view, that white nationalists wrap themselves around Christianity when I feel that their words and actions are often the antithesis of Jesus' teaching?
Ooh, yeah. I mean,
Question. Would you repeat the question? Yeah.
so how does white nationalism and Christianity, how are those so intertwined when they see so oppositional? Gosh, I wish I had the answer to that. I mean, again, that's where I think about like Christianity as a tool of empire, which, it has been since like Constantine in Rome, where it became weaponized as, a way to control the masses. And when I look at like the 1980s and the things that were being said, I mean, there are white Christian men who really think that they have been ordained by God to rule the world. I mean, they think that like they are ruling the world with God, and it is their job to infuse that into policy. And I think like this judge in Alabama, we see that. Like he is citing scripture and theology in a ruling, right? Like total perversion of separation of church and state, like on the record. I just feel like it's about people weaponizing, distorting Christianity for power, which, I mean, it doesn't have to just be Christianity. I think any tradition that is sacred gets misused that way, that it's about power over versus power with. I mean, Jesus was murdered for this. Like, I think we forget he was murdered for pushing up against this very thing. By the state. By the state, exactly. So I'm with you. I'm totally confused, but gosh, they've done a really good job. And I think when people are fearful about losing something, they can glom onto a narrative about power and blaming certain people for having lost that power. And I see that so much in the white Christian national. Like, we're losing this. We don't have family values, right? Like all of this. We're supposed to be, this kind of country. This is like what God has ordained us to be. And also, I just think the origins of this country, we do not talk about honestly, that it was built upon genocide and kidnapping and power over, right? Like that is infused in who we are. It's not Christianity. It's who we are as a country that we then slap Christianity on top of, the city on a hill. But I think we have not reckoned with our origins as a country.
And the only way to heal.
We have to start with being honest about who we are. And there's a total denial in that group about any of these things. That's why there's pushback against talking about racism and
book bannings and
yeah, I mean, if you can control the narrative about who we are, then you're going to be able to control generations behind. And I mean, as a parent myself, like I was talking to my partner this morning about like talking to my kid when George Floyd and everything happened, like educating my white child about the history of racism and police violence, like at 6. I didn't get that, but I want her to know this is why these things happen. That's not happening at a cultural level in the way that we need to actually change it. But I think there's so much work for like people who identify as white and Christian to push up against those who use our language. And I actually really recoil against folks who are like, evangelicals, like, I don't have anything to do with them. I'm like, we are in the same faith community. Like, they're not that far from you. You can't disown them. We are part of the same community. If anybody can speak to them, it's you. Yeah. So don't say you don't have anything to do with them. Like, you're the one who can actually speak the language. And I think so often we don't use the same language to fight back. And that's why I am so stubborn about staying in the tradition. It's because I'm like, you will not take this from me. There is liberation here. There is justice here. Like, you don't speak for me.
Well, and simply to say, like, that Jesus is unrecognizable to me, like is a powerful statement. Like that's talking on the same plane. Like tell me more about this Jesus, right? Because and I'll tell you about the one that I know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's, a great start, Dennis, is just to name that and to acknowledge that I'm not seeing things the way you are, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Excellent question, and really the heart of the matter.
Any others? Melva.
So I just wanted to add to the conversation. It's really been fascinating, so thank you so much for doing it. Another thing that I think is so important is we've got in 7 months a very, very important election with 2 candidates for governor who couldn't be more different from each other. And so I ask for everybody, please, no matter how you feel, get out, speak to neighbors, speak to families, speak to people who work in the stores. We really need a strong turnout because, as mentioned, in every other state where they've heavily mobilized to vote, it's come out very positive. So if we sit back and think we can't do it here, we're wrong. We can do it here. And so I'm working through churches and synagogues to work on getting it done. So, thank you for letting me know about this event and really very much.
Thank you, Melva.
And Melva's doing amazing organizing work here. It's really good to see you. And thank you for all the work that you're doing and community organizing. It's brilliant. So I'm really glad you're here.
You'll stick around for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? I don't want to cut anybody off too soon, but thank you, Katey, so much.
Thank you.
Again, there are books in the back. There's information as well about the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice and some business cards to get in touch as well.
Absolutely.
But thank you,
Thank
Katey.
you for having me.
And thanks, friends, for coming tonight.